So hello, fellow historiography students. As you know, I'm Eric Morningstar. I haven't done a video like this before, but I think it could actually be the start of a pretty good trend for a site like Patreon or YouTube. These kinds of videos could be used to help students to get primers on the books that they have to read for classes, or, just for general research purposes. I think it could be a neat idea. Everybody could, pile in videos onto a YouTube channel. Think of it. It could be good. But anyway, today I am going to be talking about Carlo Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worms, the cosmos of a 16th century Miller. Now, this is a micro-history through and through. I really want to say that I absolutely loved this book, more so than any other book that we've read so far for this semester. Why do I like it? Micro-histories, are just a great way to look at individuals like Minocchio, people who are oppressed or otherwise just ignored in history. It raises our awareness of other types of sources. This is not to say that microhistories are without problems. Obviously, that they are by their very nature. I think they have they have serious holes in their sources. There's a lack of sources. You name it. But writers of microhistories, in my experience, have been pretty good about letting readers know what those limitations are. And Ginzburg isn't different in this respect. That being said, I do have critiques for this book, and I will get to those later. Now, looking specifically to the argument of this book, it's kind of hard to locate. But on page 19, I'm just going to go ahead and read the quotes that I have over here. Says, provisionally, it's best to attribute them to a substratum, talking about Minocchio's beliefs, a substratum of peasant beliefs, perhaps centuries old, that were never wholly wiped out. By breaking the crust of religious unity, the Reformation indirectly caused these old beliefs to emerge. The Counter-Reformation, attempting to restore unity, brought them into the light of day in order to sweep them away. On the basis of this hypothesis, then, Minocchio's radical statements will not be explained by tracing them to Anabaptism, or worse yet, to a generic Lutheranism. Rather, we should ask if they don't belong within an autonomous current of peasant radicalism, which the upheaval of the Reformation had helped to bring forth, but which was much older. Okay. So, we know that in reading this book, then, we're going to trace the religiosity of this 16th century Miller, Minocchio, who gave some pretty interesting thoughts to his neighbors and to the Inquisition. A second point that Ginzburg points out comes at the tail end of the book on 120, and I'll read this quote. The renewed effort to achieve hegemony took various forms in different parts of Europe, but the evangelization of the countryside by the Jesuits and the capillary religious organization based on the family achieved by the Protestant churches can be traced to a single current. In terms of repression, the intensification of witchcraft trials and the rigid control over such marginal groups as vagabonds and gypsies corresponded to it. Minocchio's case should be seen against this background of repression and effacement of popular culture. Because Minocchio's religiosity is part of an older, partially oral, partially written, peasant religiosity, that's how we should look at this, as a repression of the popular culture that came about as part of the Counter-Reformation. So, that's what we have to work with. Really, the summary of this book is developing the argument. It's 120 pages. So, really, how does the author answer these central questions? So, what do we know about Minocchio's religiosity? So, when I started to read this book and we were learning about Minocchio's statements about the chaos cheese and God coming out of it and the creation of the worm angels, the archangels, essentially. And they were the ones that went out and did work. Obviously, this seems a bit unconventional. But there are things that Minocchio relates, either to neighbors or to the Inquisition, that really made me think that he was part of the movement coming out of the Reformation, a lot of the criticisms of the Catholic Church and certain beliefs that kind of popped up after the Reformation, developing different sects like the anti-Trinitarians, the Anabaptists. Ginzburg thought so too, but it says that it shouldn't be considered a general Lutheranism or Anabaptism. It's something deeper than that. How do we know these certain things? Take a look. I mean, this stuff is peppered throughout this book, but just some page numbers to throw in references here. The idea that Menocchio was anti-Catholic, page 15, says, everything belongs to the church and to the priests. They oppress the poor, who, if they work 2 rented fields, these fields will be fields that belong to the church, to some bishop or cardinal. Okay, so these kinds of criticisms were really typical of the Catholic Church, the idea that you have these grand cathedrals, monks are eating more, not practicing the asceticism that they really should. The idea that Menocchio's religiosity comes out of these peasant oral and earlier written works. Ginzburg traces that specifically to the books that Menocchio either explicitly stated that he read or ones that we can kind of figure it out. And these books are various, but they include Scolio Centenario, the Fioretto della Bibbia, the Decameron, Mandeville's Travels. He may have read the Quran, discussed like as part of his book collection. There was a most beautiful book. There are traces of how Menocchio talks about religion, to the way that Angel Gabriel talks to Muhammad in the Quran. But we don't know. We don't know. And Ginzburg is pretty careful to point that out. Those come from between 101 and 115. Other things that we know about Menocchio's religiosity: he denies the divinity of Christ to the Holy Office. And that was an interesting part of the book there, because denying the divinity of Christ, I was thinking, okay, so he's part of the anti-Trinitarian kind of school of thought at the time, but it's more complicated than that with the cheeseworms. And this point, denying the divinity of Christ, as well as his commentary on the Gospels, can be found on page 93, says that the Gospels are nothing but the creation of monks and priests who had some interests. Okay, so, and he, later, somewhere throughout the book, really says that, the Word of God can be reduced to 4 words. The whole idea that, it was more important to love the neighbor than even to love God, these kinds of things, it sets him apart from those other traditions. Now, the point that he denied the divinity of Christ to the Holy Office is important to consider in this book, because it's usually raised as a critique that whatever Menocchio is saying about his religion being in line with the traditions of the church could be made under duress, and he was fearful, being asked questions by the Inquisition. But as Ginzburg points out, why would someone do that in front of the Holy Office if he was really nervous? And from everything else that we learn about Menocchio in this book, we learned that he really didn't have much of a problem speaking what he thought. So now there are other sources that he could have been familiar with, like the ones that I was talking about, but also Menocchio isn't an isolated example of this older peasant traditional religion. He mentions at great length an individual named by Pellegrino Baroni, who also stated, and was questioned by the Inquisition just different times, so that the Bible was written for money, the Virgin Mary was born of a serving maid, and that there is no hell or purgatory. Okay. And these are the kinds of things that Menocchio was also saying, depending on which point in the trial that you're looking at. He said things like, God is nothing but the elements, earth, air, fire, water. Christ could have brought himself down from the cross, and if he was actually Lord, he wouldn't have allowed himself to be taken, a lot of those things. So it's not necessarily that we should believe, in Ginzburg's opinion, that Menocchio was making statements under duress, or that he was simply confused. His religiosity was formed as something that he said he had read books and divined them in his own head. And I think that Ginzburg is pretty much on board with that. But that does lead me to my critiques of this book. Namely, one, too many unknowns. Now, I say this, but as I mentioned earlier, writers of microhistories, and especially, I mean, in reading Ginzburg, there's a number of signposts that are on par with what we've seen in Brodel. He comes out and will say that there's no proof of this, that we're merely guessing, suggesting that he might have read the Quran or Dante. And there's some reason here, but there's just too much unknown to make any solid conclusions on those points. Because Ginzburg acknowledges the fact that too many things are unknown, I'm mostly willing to let that go. But there are other things that I don't let go in terms of the things that he says about Minocchio. Like Minocchio as a subject and being representative of this oral tradition and of a popular peasant oral tradition. Many of these people were illiterate. Minocchio was not. Most people were very poorly off. Minocchio was not. On 92, he points out that the Scandellas were very well off. They rented mills, and he was the bearer of messages between the Friuli and the mayor. He was a representative in government. He was designated a governor of the neighborhood of Montreal, and was generally pretty respected. And I was just kind of questioning how representative then is Minocchio of this largely oral written tradition if he's reading, writing. Not that there are necessarily any answers to that, but that's something that I would just kind of want to know more about. And also, there's a question that I have on translation in this book. On 104, they're discussing Minocchio's second trial that happened 15 years after the first one. If he says that on 104 that he wished that he had died when he was 15. Okay. Ginzburg takes that to mean Minocchio talking about not being an adult yet at 15, so that's why he wished he would have died at 15. I don't know if that's exactly what's going on here. I think it could be a translation issue because he was tried 15 years before, and his grievance is the loss of his wife and the loss of his son and the respectability that he had. Those all happened 15 years before. So again, I'm not terribly certain on how to answer that question, but I do think that it merits further research. Checking up on sources, always good practice. Comments on how this book relates to the nature of the dialectic. This whole book is a demonstration of the dialectic, right? So someone sits down to write a microhistory like this, you know that the critiques are going to come, and like I said, the number of signposts in this book are really a testament to that, saying that there's no proof that he read the Quran, and just throughout saying that, well, based on this, we can kind of gather. I mean, that's the whole argument of this book, is locating his religiosity, right? So, knowing that, you have the work, the critiques come in about the work where it's incomplete. Either the original author can go ahead, take those critiques in mind, reevaluate, and submit new knowledge, coming closer to that truth of the dialectic, or a future historian comes up and decides to examine both and make their own history that builds on the former. So this is exactly the kind of histories and the process that I like about historical writing that I want to do myself. Also, not necessarily central to Ginzburg's main point of the book, but there is a discussion of certain literatures, in particular utopian literatures, that could be considered demonstrative of the dialectic as well. Talking about how, comparing the different utopian style literatures, the idea that, is it something to really be desired, or is it something that's even possible? These kind of things can be compared against one another to come at a more in-depth knowledge of utopian literature. and also the belief systems that's just kind of built into the book. When we're locating Minocchio's religiosity, we're also having those discussions about what makes an Anabaptist, an anti-Trinitarian, anti-Trinitarian, so forth. By using him as an example, it opens up doors for people to go ahead and say, well, this person has this kind of beliefs. So again, multiple sources come together, argue, dialectic. Now, I hope that this video has been informative. Like I said, I don't know how much it's going to be received, but I certainly had a fun time making it. And again, I could not recommend this book more to anyone that's interested, both in, 1500s really counts as medieval, but 16th century historical topic, microhistories. Yeah, I think it's great. I can't wait to see all of you tomorrow, and good luck.